Hi everyone and welcome. My name is Lara Van Lith and I'm a water resource specialist with the City of Phoenix. This class is Native Landscape Care and it's a part of our annual webinar series, Hydrate the Valley Phoenix, sponsored by the Phoenix Water Services Department. Kaylee Colter, founder of 88 Acres, will be our expert presenter tonight on behalf of Watershed Management Group. Tonight's presentation will be recorded and uploaded to the City of Phoenix YouTube channel and our Save Water website if you would like to share it or reference it in the future. We will pause in the middle for a quick break to answer some questions and to step away for a minute, probably around the 1 hour mark. And if you have any questions throughout the class, please feel free to put them in the chat and we can answer them halfway through or at the end. This session is a little different from the first one, so you should be able to see everyone's comments and be able to, instead of just being able to message me or Kaylee. So keep in mind, be respectful and try not to distract from anyone's learning. So with that, we can go ahead and take it away. Thanks, Kaylee.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for joining in tonight. As Lars said, my name, let's see, let me make sure I'm ready to go here. There we go. Okay. So yes, my name is Kaylee Colter. I'm a landscape architect. I practice here in the Phoenix metro area. I am here on behalf of Watershed Management Group. So I think you guys have already heard from Charlie down in Tucson, but WMG is a nonprofit group based down in Tucson with the mission of helping people live more sustainable livelihoods. And they are involved in all kinds of things, water and environment related. So if you ever have a chance to get down there, it's a great visit. If you're in Tucson, they have a living learning lab center that you can visit and tour and have all kinds of educational things on display. So if you're ever able to go, that's worth the trip. But today we're going to be talking about landscape care, and we're going to be talking about some ways we can kind of shift our practices to help support and care for our landscapes in a way that supports a healthy landscape, but also in a way that kind of supports sustainability. So one of these things that we're going to be, is going to come up a couple times tonight is this idea of kind of shifting our mindset. And so for a lot of us, the relationship to caring for the landscape or caring for your yard, um, and we might be using words like maintenance. We might call it a chore. It might literally be a chore for some of our kids or for us to do. And so there can sometimes be this connotation of, this is kind of just another something that you have to do. It's another thing on your plate. And totally understand because I definitely find myself feeling that way as well. But we just want to try and kind of shift that mindset a little bit into seeing those tasks that you do, those chores, the outdoor yard work that you're doing, as a way to care for your landscape, to actually kind of promote the health and longevity of your landscape long term. And the other thing we want to do is with that care, with those practices that we engage in, to make sure that our landscapes become more kind of self-sufficient over time. And so we'll be looking at practices that, in the long term actually reduce how much work we're going to be doing as opposed to kind of adding to it. So one of those words that helps us kind of promote the longevity of our landscape is regenerative. You might be familiar with this word. It's been a little bit buzzy in the last couple of years. But when we are talking about designing and caring for a regenerative landscape, it's one that continues to improve over time as opposed to one that continues to degrade over time. And so, this picture is, these three pictures are a great example of, um, on the left here, a really regenerative landscape. So we have a curbside basin here. It's got native plants in it. It's got a lot of plants growing in here. That's going to increase the effectiveness of that basin over time. Those plants are going to grow in and take up space. They're going to prevent weeds from growing in. That's going to reduce how much weeding is going to have to happen over time. So there's a lot of things occurring in that landscape that actually will promote less work. As opposed to the other two images which we've got here, which are going to promote more work. So in this middle one here, we have a kind of grass based what's supposed to be looks like a basin. And we can see that some of the best practices weren't used here. So there's not rock mulch, there's not a spillway into this basin. It's filled up with sediment. It's become less effective at absorbing water over time. Looks like the soil's probably been compacted a little bit. And so instead of that landscape becoming more efficient and more effective over time, it's becoming less. And so it's going to take now a big effort to kind of go in there, dig that dirt out, kind of reestablish that basin. And so we kind of want to move away from practices like that. And then the final one here, you can see definitely not regenerative. Well, I mean, I don't know, that tree might try to regenerate, but the type of landscaping that's been done here, and even you can see kind of like the rock mulch, like the slope in here, it's kind of washing away or eroding away. This is a landscape that's going to continue to need to be cared for. So this is probably wasn't the right tree in the right place, which is something we'll talk about later on today. And so all these practices we're going to talk about today are going to kind of move us towards the direction of this first image, where that landscape becomes better able to function, better able to take care of itself, and you have less input into it over time. Okay, so you have probably seen landscapes like this around the valley or at some point. And so we're going to talk about some things. I think this picture is a pretty good standard example. It's pretty common to see some of these practices, and so we'll talk about some of the ways we can improve on that. One of the big things here, and this is kind of more of a design decision than as opposed to a maintenance decision, but there is not a lot of landscape going on here at all. And so not having that ground cover that is living organic ground cover really increases the likelihood and the ability for weeds to pop up and to become a problem. And so once they've kind of presented themselves, then you've got to do something with them, right? And so you can see this image here is the dyed herbicide that's used to help manage those weeds. And because it's such a vast area, of course, it makes sense, if you're taking care of this landscape to use something like that because it's so much area to have to hand weed. And so, some of the design decisions we make, like, there may not be very many plants to take care of, but now that means that there's more to do in terms of weeding. And so, increasing the density of plants from a design standpoint can help you later on with your maintenance. Some other things that I see here in this landscape, we have quite a bit of pruning some shrubs here into shapes that are not quite what they would naturally like to be. I can tell that with some of these sages back here, but also in the picture on the right. Um, the kind of pineapple-y looking plant here is a desert spoon. And these are actually one of the lowest maintenance plants you can plant. And so all this pruning that's been done to remove these leaves is completely unnecessary in terms of the health of the plant. And so there's a lot of just kind of over pruning, overwork done here. There's not a lot of, life going on in this landscape. And because of that, we're relying on some techniques like herbicide to help care and take care of this landscape. So what I'm kind of going to propose to you guys tonight is that to help, rethink our landscape care to move more towards landscapes that look like this. This is a more naturally cared for landscape. You can see there's a lot of use of native plants here. These are some native mesquite trees. You can see that uh, the annual grasses and flowers have been allowed to grow, and you can see they're starting to die back, and they've just been allowed to do that in place. They're not kind of over um, manicuring this landscape to take out all of the to apply herbicide to get rid of all those low growing things. Because of that density, we've got plants that are native and plants that we want, as opposed to weed plants coming up. And you can, some of the things you may not be able to tell, but having that um, cover from these smaller plants actually does help provide a little degree of, well, it provides shade for the ground. So that's actually kind of acting like a living mulch and helping keeps moisture in the soil. That also helps kind of protect some of these plants a little bit. Some of these agaves and cacti can be sensitive to the sun. And so that kind of helps protect that. And another thing you're not seeing here, but I'm sure is here, is wildlife. And so that there is, not this kind of hygienic landscape. There is life in this landscape, and so that means there's seeds for birds to eat. There's little materials that they can pick up to use to make nests and things like that. And so having a landscape that's got life in it allows other life, to kind of inhabit and use that landscape. So that's the direction we're going to kind of go with some of the practices that we talk about tonight. Okay. So we're going to start with, we have got a couple of topics to cover. The first thing we're going to talk about tonight is soil health. Soil health is really foundational to caring for a landscape long term and having that regenerative landscape. We'll talk about watering and irrigation because that is such a big thing for us here in the desert, in the Sonoran Desert. Seasonality, we'll talk about some of the things that change and need to be done throughout the different seasons, some essential tools, and then we'll get into some specifics on certain plants, and just a little dive into weeds, at least some of the common ones that you'll see. Okay. So building soil health. Soil is a huge component of having a healthy, thriving landscape, and especially having one, that has resilience, that is regenerative, that can kind of sustain itself over time. And there's kind of two ingredients that we really need to have in soil to promote a healthy landscape, and that's water and carbon, which would be organic material. So often our soils in the desert or in any arid desert environment can be kind of low in these two things, right? We don't have a ton of water, we don't have a ton of rain, and we often tend to lack in organic material in our soils. So supplementing and being able to kind of infuse your soil with these two things is going to kickstart the life in your soil. So it's going to kickstart, if you've heard of the, soil microbiome, that's the combination of all the insects, nematodes, bacteria, fungi, all of those organisms that break down materials in the soil, turn those materials into nutrients that are available to plants. They're essential to having this thriving soil, and they need organic matter and water to thrive. So that's what we want to start with. Um, we will be talking about designing a rainwater harvesting based landscape. And so that is a great way to start in terms of adding water. So I'm not just suggesting that you go out and just, throw the hose out and start, putting water on your soil. But what we do want to do is design the landscape so that water has the ability to infiltrate into our soil. And so when we talk about water harvesting landscape design, we will talk about some techniques for that. But what I want to just encourage here is that you're thinking about, we like to say, like, planting the water before you plant plants. So thinking about where that water is going to infiltrate and be able to get into your soil before you start planning out your landscaping. So this little graphic here kind of shows that cycle and shows this ideal process. So first we want to plant the water. So we want to increase soil moisture so that we can spark that ability of the soil microbiome to kick into gear, help us start creating nutrition, breaking down organic matter. And ideally, we're going to do that through different rainwater harvesting techniques. And then the next step is to, okay, so we want to protect what soil we do have. So soil is susceptible to erosion. So erosion can often happen either through wind or through water movement. So we want to do things within the landscape to prevent that. Mulch is one of the most important ways to do that. Mulch kind of helps keep soil so that it is protected and not exposed to those elements. And then we also want to eliminate eliminate, at least reduce, or only use in specific areas chemicals if we can. In particular, we want to be considering pesticides because what we're trying to do here is get the soil microbiome going. And right, those good bugs that we need are also susceptible to pesticides, just like the bad bugs that we may be trying to keep away. And so the longer we continue to use those practices, the less success we're going to have in getting that soil microbiome going. So that's kind of the first part, right? Like keeping what we've already got going for us. And then three, then we start to mix in organic matter or adding that, we had water plus organic matter. Now we're going to add the organic matter. Um, when I say organic, I'm not necessarily meaning like organic in the sense of like USDA organic, like chemical free, all of the kind of characteristics of that. I mean materials that were or are living. And so when I talk about organics or adding organics, what I'm talking about would be like wood chips or compost. And those things could be used as a mulch or they could be used as soil amendments where they're actually mixed into the soil. Just kind of depends on the case. And we can also kind of, tying this into step four, we can also use plants as part of our organic matter, right? So we want to be adding plants to the landscape. They're an important part of getting the soil going. And so plants can kind of be a living organic matter that we add to the landscape. We want to be thinking about adding a really good diversity of plants and plants that may have particular benefits in terms of soil health. So one would be like bunch grasses, so native bunch grasses that kind of grow in little clumps. They're really great for helping us reduce erosion because they have really fibrous root systems. We may want to consider plants that are what are called nitrogen fixers, meaning that they are able to they're better able to access nitrogen in the soil. And so that can be really beneficial in terms of helping that soil health as well. So there's some different things we might consider in terms of the plants that we select, but overall we want to be looking at making sure we're adding more organic matter. Okay, so a couple examples peppered through here. So this is an example of a water harvesting landscape, and we're just going to kind of look at how some of those techniques manifest themselves in this landscape. So in terms of planning the water, so the main water source is actually water that is shedding off of this road here. You'll see that they don't have any kind of curb or gutter here. So that means that the water can do what we call sheet flow. So it can just flow right off the street and it can go into the landscape. It looks like they have a couple of little, you can see these where the water is kind of coming across in these straight lines here. So it looks like they have a couple of shallow swales that help just direct that water to their landscape over here. And you can see another long swale here that's going across their driveway. What's great about these swales is that these are really shallow, right? Like if you were kind of looking at them without water in them, you might not even notice that they're there. And so sometimes, that's all it takes in order to move water where we'd like it to go. All right, so we're planting water. And we are doing some work to stabilize the soils here. So you'll see in this example, they have used rock mulch instead of using an organic mulch. And one of the reasons here is that this is a street side landscape. And so water could come off of the street at pretty good velocity, and it can kind of go down the street with a pretty good velocity here. And so the rock mulch is a little bit better at kind of staying in place than organic wood chip mulch might be. And so for this example, that would be a great application of rock mulch. The thing to note about mulches is that a mulch can really be any material that you put on top of bare soil. So a mulch can be wood chips, it could be compost, it can be rocks, it could be plastic tarp. If that application made sense. So the main thing is that the mulch is helping to cover the bare soil. And so rock mulch does that. It covers the bare soil, which means it's helping keep moisture in the soil, reducing evaporation, and it's helping prevent the soil from being exposed to airborne or waterborne erosion. So from that perspective, it's doing its job. It's just not doing, when you use an organic mulch, it can do even more than that, right? It starts to add more benefits to the soil. Okay, organic matter. So primarily, the organic matter that they're using for this landscape is coming from their planted organic matter. So you can see in these little landscape areas here, they're really heavily planted. So those plants are providing a nice living mulch cover for that landscape. And there's a lot of grasses. I can see some grasses in here. So that's helping reduce erosion. So the actual living organic matter is playing a big part in this landscape. Okay, this one, a little bit different, right? This is not necessarily a roadside application. In this case, the water is coming actually from this roof that's kind of behind this landscape area here. You can't quite see it, but there is a gutter coming from this building. And if you see in this little corner here, there's a little bit of a green thing that you can kind of see. It looks like a circle. And that's what's called a pop-up valve. So that gutter goes underground here into a PVC pipe. And this is a pop-up valve. So when water is coming through, the pressure of the water will pop that valve up so that the water can come out. And then when there's no water flowing, the lid pops back down. And so this basin that's lined with rock here gets filled with water from that roof. So that's the water source that we're using to kind of kickstart the soil in this landscape area. They're using a couple of techniques here to stabilize that soil. So they're using a combination of rock mulch. You'll see on the higher areas, they've used a rock mulch. Partially, it looks like that is to help kind of facilitate a pathway and like a little seating area. But you'll also see that they have incorporated organic mulch as well. So the bottom of the basin has wood chip mulch in it. So that's a great way if you're not, totally comfortable using an organic mulch yet, is to kind of combine it. And so you just use the wood chip mulch or organic mulch in your basin areas, and then use the rock mulch everywhere else. That's another way to do it. And another thing that they're doing to stabilize the soils here, which isn't necessary for every project, but just showing you guys as an example, is that they have lined the basin with these larger rocks, almost boulder size. These are kind of what we would call riprap. So because they're using these rocks to stabilize the edge of that soil or the edge of the basin, they can make the basin deeper because they can make that edge steep. If you did not protect it with rock, the soil wouldn't be able to hold that edge and it would just keep eroding away. But because they've used the riprap, the soil will stay in place. So it's a great technique to use, if you have kind of a narrow area like this and you're trying to increase how much um, a depth you have in your basin and how much room you have to store water. Uh, Using riprap or something to stabilize the edge of the basin can help with that. All right, great. So they've got organic matter in here. And then again, they've got a great combination of plants. I really like the selection of plants that are used in the basin bottoms. You'll see the bunch grasses and kind of a focus on um, shrubs. These are growing in. And then you'll see that on the upper areas, so the areas that aren't going to get saturated with water, that's where they have cacti. So they've got some agaves and prickly pears. And that's the right technique. So whenever you're kind of doing design work with rainwater harvesting, you want to put cacti in the higher areas. You don't want them to be susceptible to um, getting kind of soaked with water. They get kind of they can get waterlogged and they can rot. So we want to prevent that from happening. And even though they're kind of, they don't look like they're in the basin bottom, what we're doing is really activating this soil, right? With by adding water and letting it infiltrate, we're increasing the water holding capacity. These plants are going to be able to access that water. So even if you're putting them up here, they're going to be able to make use of that moisture that's in the soil. So don't be worried that they're not going to be able to get any benefit from it. Okay. So just to kind of show you a little example of how what kind of happens to that mulch. So you see it in the bottom of the basin here. This was a wood chip mulch. This mulch was um, uh, briefly composted, so it wasn't fresh wood chip trimmings when they put it down, but it was not composted all the way to compost. So it's kind of in between. And so that allows it to kind of continue that process in the landscape. And so you'll see this is an example with fresh trimmings. So these are trimmings directly from an arborist. That means this was a tree that went in the wood chipper, and this is what came out. And you'll see what starts to happen is that fungi. So different fungus start to inhabit and kind of take over that wood chip. So that's kind of the starting point of breaking that material down. You may either be able to see in the bottom right here, you can kind of see there's a little bit of like white on that wood chips. And that is uh, the hyphae of the fungus. So that's actually kind of the um, structures that help the fungus transport nutrients and water and things like that. So you can start to actually see that, forming networks in the wood chips. So if you see that, don't worry. It's actually a good sign. It means that that material is starting to get broken down. Eventually, you may actually see mushrooms, which are the fruiting body. So once the fungus, kind of completes its life cycle, it will throw up the mushrooms. So those are all good signs if you see that happening with your organic mulch. And then what will happen is that, right at that layer where the wood chip and the soil meet, that's where that material is going to get broken down into its finest, and it's going to start getting incorporated into the soil. So if you kind of dig down, you'll start to see this. If you've done a lot of gardening, um, uh, you might be familiar with this kind of humus type material that's very fine and soft and kind of fluffy, and that's what'll start to form, right there at the intersection of the wood chips and the soil. So that's what you want, and that's a good sign that we're kind of creating healthier soil. Um, and that's what you'll start to see over time. All right. So how much mulch are we talking about? Like how much do you need to add in order for this to happen? So there's no super like hard and fast rule about this. In upland areas, so these would be areas that aren't in the bottoms of your basin, you can probably go as low as 1 to 2 inches. Some factors that will influence that would be what size the wood chips are. This picture on the right here, these are fresh trimmings from an arborist. I can tell just because there's kind of some long strips in here and it doesn't have an even texture and size to it. And so sometimes it can be hard to do a thin layer of material like that just because of all the different sizes. So that could affect it. You might also want to be thinking about if you have existing plants, you don't always want to build up too much of a thick layer of mulch around the base of existing plants. But if you don't have a lot growing at the moment, then you can increase that and add even more. So that's an option. But then we do like to have a thicker layer in your water harvesting features, like your basin bottoms. So you can go 2 to 4 inches in these areas. One of the reasons being that the material is going to break down faster in those basin bottoms because there's more water available. And so there's going to be more of that biological activity going on. And what was the other thing I was going to say? Oh, the other thing to think about too when you're putting this mulch down is that um, when you first put it down, you probably want to put it a little bit thicker than you actually want it because it will compact. So when you put it down, it's going to kind of, be kind of a little bit fluffy and the pieces are, not going to kind of fit together yet. And so over time, once it gets walked on and rained on and things like that, it will start to compact. So always do a little bit more than you think you're going to do. Okay, and so those are materials, these wood chip materials. The other thing to kind of talk about a little bit here is where do you get this material? Where does it come from? So one great source would be from, I keep saying arborist trimmings. And so that means, anytime an or tree worker is working on a tree and they chip up the trees, um, that would be arborist trimmings. It's great for organic mulch for your landscape. Uh, some things to note is that one, usually this is a free source of material because otherwise these companies usually have to pay to take the stuff to the landfill. So that's one thing. If you can kind of find somebody who's willing to, dump the load for you for free, you can usually do that. You can also use services like Chip Drop, which you can kind of sign up for and get in a queue. And so then when it's your turn, they'll come drop a load for you. The only um, kind of downside there is that you don't necessarily get to pick what time, and you don't really get to pick how much. So those are some downsides there, but it is free. Um, so that would be arborist trimmings. The other thing to make sure that you do if you're getting arborist trimmings is to ask for a clean load. And so this typically means no palm fronds, no oleanders, and for some people, it'll mean no mesquites as well. If you're using this in an area where there's going to be a lot of people walking, you might want to consider, not having mesquites or other thorn varieties of trees, 'cause sometimes those thorns can kind of poke, not kind of, they can poke right through your shoe. So it kind of depends on where that mulch is going. The other option in terms of wood chips would be a composted wood chip product. So this is a product that you can purchase from, any company that sells it. Some of the sources in town include Grow Well Organics. They are a wholesale soil producer, and their headquarters is right by the transfer station. In Phoenix. Uh, the Arizona Worm Farm also sells this mulch. And Sing Farms has in the past. I'm not sure if theirs is still available or not. So there's a couple of places where you can get that, but it's basically arborist trimmings that have been somewhat composted. And so the nice thing is that you can order it, you know exactly how much you're getting, you know how much it's going to cost, when it's going to be delivered, and it'll have a more uniform appearance to it. So if you're kind of wanting something that will look a little bit neater, that's a better choice. So those are some options and places where you can find organic mulch. The other thing is to look for other sources of mulch in your yard. So if you have trees that you're pruning, shrubs you're pruning, if you have trees that drop their leaves, which if you have trees that are alive, that you do, um, those can all be sources of mulch as well. So that is all material that you can use and, um, kind of introduce into your landscape so that it gets broken down and reintroduced back into your soil. One of the things I really like to point out is that, we are using all of these resources that are in the soil to grow these plants. So in this case, this picture on the left you're looking at is a peach tree. And so it's taking up nutrients and minerals from the soil. It's creating all those great leaves to help support the plant, the tree, and then dropping those leaves. If you bag those leaves up and put them out for bulk trash or put them in your trash can, you are kind of creating a stop in the nutrient cycle because typically those leaves would get broken back down and that nutrition would get released back into the soil. And it's great because it's the nutrition that that plant needs, right? Uh, but when we bag it and take it somewhere else, that means we're extracting the nutrition from our soil and we're not putting it back. So over time, your soil becomes more degraded. And we've been talking about regenerative practices, right? So we want to be doing our best to reintroduce those nutrients to keep that, nutrient cycle closed, so that our soil continues to improve over time instead of becomes degraded over time. Now, some people are a little bit less comfortable with, just letting mulch and, flower debris and things like that fall in the yard. And that's okay too. But there are some other ways to think about it. You might collect that and use that in your compost bin. Often, you're going to need a good source of carbon and nitrogen materials if you're doing compost. And so leaf droppings and things like that, really great source of carbon for composting. So yeah, I just encourage you to kind of, be open-minded about it, consider whether or not, you'd be interested in letting those leaves and debris fall and be mulch in your yard, or if there's another way that you could at least collect that material and use it in the landscape. Okay, so one of the things I mentioned was if you have existing plants, you don't want to let that layer of mulch build up too much around the plant. And so I just want to explain that a little bit here. This is a great example of it. This is a citrus tree, and you can see they did a great job of building up their mulch basin around the base of that tree. The problem is that this tree was planted too deep. So when it was planted too deep. And the reason we can tell that is because there should be what's called the trunk flare. And so if you've ever, if you've been a kid or seen one of those classic kid drawings of a tree, there's always that little flare at the base of the tree where it kind of, uh, you know, flares out, right? That's where the name comes from. And this is a really important part for the tree because there's a lot of oxygen exchange that happens here at that point of the tree. It's kind of where there's the change from um, branch structure to root structure, and it's a really important part of the tree. And so when that area gets covered with soil or covered with mulch, it makes it harder for that tree to exchange oxygen and to get the kind of airflow that it needs. And so it can start to rot. Um, it can cause damage to the roots. It's one of those things that you don't see overnight, but over the long term, it will create a problem. And so when you're adding mulch, you just want to be really aware of that. You don't want to kind of continue to keep building mulch up at the base of the trunk of your tree. Um, so good thing to do to start off with, make sure you plant that tree at the right depth and you plant that root flare at the top of the soil. And then if you're adding mulch, it's good to kind of keep that mulch, a foot or so away from the base of that tree. That way you can kind of prevent that buildup from happening. Okay, so that's all the fun stuff with soil. You guys are going to get that soil cooking and those microbes going. And the next thing we're going to talk about is irrigation. This is actually that same landscape that we were looking at earlier on the example. And this is it grown in. So you can see it's kind of definitely taken a different look. And so the question here that I've asked is, if there's anything in this landscape that needs to be irrigated. Um, and the answer is no. Well, kind of yes and no. Um, Everything that you plant in your landscape, because we're in Arizona, needs to be irrigated until it's established. So even if you're planting some agaves or things that seem really tough, until they get established, they need some water. And so I'll show you on the next couple of slides here, we kind of have a recommendation on how much time that takes to get the establishment. But after you do that, these are all native plants. And so if you're using all native plants, and even if you're using mostly, regionally adapted plants or desert plants, you can wean your landscape off of irrigation over time so that you're not having to continuously provide irrigation to that landscape, which is great, right? That's another method of promoting this regenerative landscape, is that it continues to thrive without you having to constantly add resources into it. So that's great, and um, that can be kind of the goal. So if you kind of you combine this rainwater harvesting with plant selection and great maintenance, where you're getting those plants established and healthy, then you can have that long-term benefit of weaning the landscape off of irrigation. And lucky for you guys, we're also going to be covering, landscape rainwater harvesting design. So we'll talk about how to design those kinds of landscapes, and then we're also talking about plant selection. So we'll talk about native plants that'll be good for that kind of design. Okay, so some guidelines for watering plants until they're established. So um, what we have been recommending, and my recommendation is starting to adjust a little bit based on the weather the last couple of years, but we want to make sure that you water uh, sufficiently at least through the first year. So the first year, you're not going to engage in any kind of weaning or overly conservative watering. You want to really get those roots established, because oftentimes what's happening in that first year is that you've got a plant that's got a lot of foliage on top of it, but it's been in a container. So the roots are not really, equal in proportion to the foliage. And so that first year, you're trying to get those two things to balance out so that the roots can fully support the foliage. And so we want that to happen for at least the first year. Now, I've been in the past said water everything at least through the first summer. Um, these days, I like to say at least through 2 summers. Just because it kind of depends on the time of year. If you're going to plant, right now, you may have enough time for those plants to really get established before the next summer hits. But if you're kind of planting anytime outside of that, I would kind of consider watering all the way through um, 2 summers, so that they've got a nice, good um, root system that can carry them through those periods of drought. Anyway, that's my general caveat. But when you first plant, you want to water, so in the first week or two, right? First 2 weeks, you want to water every 1 to 2 days. You want to keep that soil moist. Um, and then after those first 2 weeks, after that kind of initial shock from the planting, then you can dial back based on the season. So if you're in the summer, you want to water at least 2 times a week. If you're in the summer and it's raining, so like kind of right now, then you could water 1 to 2 times a week. It kind of depends on the timing. And then the cooler seasons, you can also water every 1 to 2 weeks. So you're really paying attention to the landscape. what you want to see is you want to water your plants. And before you water them again, you want to see the top couple inches of that soil dry out a little bit. If it's soaking wet, on top of the soil and you're still putting water down, then you're probably going to be overwatering. So you just want to make sure that you get that soil to dry out just a little bit, and then the next application of water can go down. Okay, so once you're ready to wean off, then you can go towards a more conservative watering schedule. So in the summer, you can go down to once a week. In the summer monsoon season, you can do no more than once a week, but if we've gotten rain, then you can dial that watering back. And then in fall, winter, spring, when we're having good weather, you can do once or twice a month. So it really can be dialed back a lot. Now, what I would say or recommend is that when you're ready to start this weaning process, I would start it in the fall. Um, or at least I would avoid starting it in the spring, because in the spring, you're going to move into the summer. So you're already kind of creating some stress and then going to send all your plants into the stressful period of summer. So anytime you start weaning or you start reducing the water, it's good to start that, in a period of time where the plants are not going to be undergoing stress anyway. And then your third year, that's when you can really start to dial back. So in the winter, you may not need to water more than once a month. And in the summer as well, just depends on, if we're getting irrigation or, how things are looking, what the temperatures are like, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. So how should I water?
Kaylee, if you're ready now, we can take a
Yeah.
quick break, or if you want to start this slide first, up to you.
Let me finish this irrigation bit and then we can
Okay.
stop at the yeah, okay.
Yeah, sounds good.
So cool. Because I'm sure you guys are on the edges of your seats thinking about irrigation here. So I have to say my personal recommendation is always to try and install some sort of automated drip irrigation if you can. Um, but I would say the caveat is you have to know yourself. So if you're able and willing to water manually, then go for it. But just know, it's just one of those things that can be really stressful. And if you forget, you can really lose plants quickly. And so I always recommend having some sort of automated drip irrigation system. That's the kind of most foolproof and most efficient way to do that watering. Now you do have some options, so you don't have to just install, really expensive automated system. There are systems, especially if you're going to be watering temporarily, that you can hook up to a hose bib or some other feature like that. So this picture on the left is actually a really simple setup that's coming from a rain tank, and they've got what is just a timer hooked up to this hose bib, so they can set the frequency and the duration, how long that water should run, and then it just runs into their drip. I can see this black tubing here is their poly drip system. So that's a pretty inexpensive way. You don't have to run power to it. You don't have to, dig and bury boxes and tap into your water line and all that kind of stuff. It can just be hooked up to a hose bib. Another simple solution here on the right, these are actually just 5-gallon buckets that have had small holes drilled in the bottom. So you can fill that bucket all the way up. The holes let the water slowly drain out or drip out, which is what drip irrigation does. And then when it's done, you can fill it up again. Now you have to be okay with how that looks. So that's kind of up to you, and you'd have to be okay with filling up buckets all the time. But it is an option, especially like I said, if your goal is to wean your landscape off of irrigation over time, you may not want to invest in drip irrigation and not be using it forever. The other option that you'd have too is especially if you're watering temporarily, is to run your irrigation above ground as opposed to running it underground. So you can see a little bit in this picture, you can see some black tubing running across the soil here. And then you can see the smaller distribution tubing running from that. The great thing about this is once you're done with it, you can easily find it, roll it up and get, take it out of the yard. So it doesn't have to stay there looking like that. Um, and again, it's great if you're kind of doing a temporary situation. Um, Now, one of the downsides here is that it's, especially if you live somewhere where there's a lot of bunnies, things like that, they can do a lot of damage to this infrastructure because they're looking for water and things like that. But on the upside, it's all visible. So, if there's a leak, you'll probably be able to see it and fix it right away. As opposed to, sometimes when you have a leak underground, it can go a while without being detected. So there's some, positives and minuses to that solution. But the most important thing is where you set up that irrigation. So what we want to encourage you to do, what you want to encourage your plants to do, is to develop a really robust root system. And so ideally, a plant's root system is kind of lined up with the extent of its canopy. So if you were to draw a line from the edge of where where the leaves end straight down to the soil, that's kind of where the roots end as well. And you always want to be putting your water at that point. So you always want to be watering kind of right at the canopy edge or the drip edge. And the reason is you always want to be encouraging those roots to grow out that way. If you, put the irrigation emission points right at the base of the tree when it's planted, that's great for when it's first planted because that's where the root ball is. But if the emitters stay there, then the roots will stay there and it won't develop a really nice, robust root system. And that root system is what helps give the trees and plants their stability. So that means you may have to move those irrigation emitter points, throughout time as your tree grows, but you always want to try to be watering at the drip line or drip edge of the canopy. This is just, some examples of rooting structure. So some uh, plants often have different different ways that their roots grow. We have a lot of trees here that have a tap root, so they have one long strong root and they have a lot of surface roots. But for the most part, most trees are going to have all their roots within the first 3 feet of that soil and to the edge of the canopy. And so that's what we're going to kind of be thinking of when you're planning your watering. The other thing that we want to encourage here is long and slow watering as opposed to short, quick waterings. Another way to really encourage that root system is long, slow waterings. Uh, and uh, and so that way the plants get a deep soaking. Because if you think about it, if you're running drip emitters and they run at 1 or 2 gallons per hour, and you only run that irrigation for 20 minutes, you're not even really putting a full gallon of water down for that plant. So we really want to make sure the soil of the root zone gets saturated. Um, and what I recommend for people when they're trying to figure out, how much water to put down, it's that you want to figure out how long it takes you to run your irrigation to saturate the soil. And once you figure that out, don't change the time. What you want to change is the duration. So if you figure out that it takes you an hour and a half to make sure your soil is saturated and you've done a full watering, you'll always water for an hour and a half. And then when the season changes, right, and the weather improves, what you'll do is water, once a month instead of twice a month. And so that way the time you're watering doesn't change, but how frequently you do it changes. And that will really help you develop a really robust root system. Okay, so I'll leave it at that. And then, yeah, I don't know how you want to do it, Laura, if you want to take questions first or take the break and then do questions, but I'll let you kind of take the
Yeah,
wheel.
maybe let's just answer these two that we got in chat and then we'll leave some time. People can ask questions while we take a quick break. So
Sure.
we have two questions. The first one is, there's concern with organic wood chip mulch that there may be scorpions. Is this true?
So my understanding is that scorpions are not a big fan of the wood chip mulch. So I think they've done a little bit of research on this down at the U of A. And especially with the larger diameter materials, so the larger size wood chips, um, it's actually like too clunky and uh, chunky for them to really enjoy using that. So that's my understanding is that it's not particularly attractive to scorpions. That if anything, the finer compost might be more attractive, but if you're using the larger wood chip material, you should be fine. And frankly, the, the other thing they found with their research is the thing that's most attractive to scorpions are those cinder block fence walls. So those dually walls, um, that they love the crevices and they can slide in between the joints and all that kind of stuff. So you're more likely to see them attracted to that if you have that than you would be to the wood chips.
Awesome. We also have a question. How do you prevent mulch from floating away or flowing into one area of the basin?
Yeah, that can be kind of hard. So one thing would be again to use those larger diameter wood chips. So the smaller material you're using, the more likely it is to be able to float away. So that's one thing. Another thing is give it a little bit of time because as it does form those mycelial networks and gets broken down, it kind of creates like a little bit of a mat. And so that kind of helps keep it in place. And then the other thing, there are some design considerations for your basin. So if your basin has more than one input to it, so if water can come in from more than one place, that can create more movement of the wood chips because it can move through the basin and then move out. So one way to manage that is to have one water entry point to the basin so that once water comes in and once that basin is full, water doesn't come out. So that's another way to deal with it. Within the basin itself, it's likely that mulch will kind of move around in that basin. So um, that is just that will be kind of more of a maintenance thing, is just making sure that you're okay with that, or if you or that you don't mind just doing a little tidying after storm events. Um, and the other thing, I don't know if that picture showed it, it does a little bit. One thing you can do if you're concerned with that mulch kind of um, getting pushed up against a tree trunk or something like that. You'll see in this example, they have planted the tree on a little bit of like a uh, no, I can't think of the word on, but it's planted a little bit higher, so it's not in the bottom of the basin. And then that way that the mulch doesn't get moved around up there, right? Like it stays the water and the mulch move around below the tree, and then this is elevated a little bit, so that doesn't happen. So there's just, a couple little design considerations that will, make that less likely to occur.
Cool. Okay, I think we have two more actual questions. Someone said, I keep killing lantanas year round. When should I plant new ones?
This is the perfect time to start planting new things. So the fall is great, especially right now. We still have a little bit of warmish weather, so that kind of helps kick in some growth. This is the ideal time. Um, you can plant any plant any time of the year, but the fall is ideal. One thing to be mindful of if you're planting lantanas this time of year is that they can be frost sensitive. So if we do happen to get freezing temperatures in the winter and you've already planted your lantana, make sure that you give them a nice watering soaking, like give them a nice soaking water. Um, the day that we're supposed to have the frost, and then try to cover them if you can. And those two things should help reduce the potential losses during the freezing temperatures.
Okay, last one. Isn't cedar mulch supposed to also be good for keeping pests away?
Yeah, cedar mulch does have that reputation. It's hard to find here, and expensive. And so if you have, a small area or limited area that you'd like to use it in, that might be a good option. But for most circumstances, it's hard to find here. You may be able to find redwood mulch more easily. But it's just pricey, and so, it tends to kind of not be a really viable option most of the time.
Awesome. Okay, we have a few comments when we were going through those. Someone said, I've had wood chip mulch in my yard for years and I don't have any scorpions. Also, it hasn't floated away when the mulch has multiple sizes. The bag nuggets you can get may help with that. Someone else says cedar mulch helped me with pests. Our yard is all rocks and we have a ton of scorpions. Yeah. That definitely seems to be the issue with rocks. My wood chips float to lower spots of my yard. Water slopes away from my house. And then with the lantana question, Jules said, if you get yellow and pink lantana, it will reseed itself. So cool. Thank you for those comments, guys. I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that.
Well, you might not want the reseeding, so it depends if you've got somewhere that because lantana in some places is invasive. Here it tends not the weather is not ideal for it, but yeah, just keep that in mind if it can grow out of control too because of that reseeding.
It looks like we have one more question before we get started again. We have Texas sages that are established, but last year I over trimmed it or it was too dry, and some of them have sections where they haven't grown leaves or flowered for 2 years now. I've checked the branches and they aren't dead, but they are just bare sticks. What should I do with them? Will they eventually rebloom or will they die?
Hmm, that's an interesting question. So, especially because you've checked them. So that's great technique or trick rather to check and make sure that they're still alive. Um, One of the things that you could do is just try and refresh that prune again. So make sure you prune down to about a half an inch above the next bud. So if there is a bud growing, or you can see where there would be a bud node on that branch, trim down to so you're about a half an inch above that next node. And then just see if that helps, like if that one more gives a little like pulse of stimulation to it. Otherwise, they may not come back. It's a little odd that they would be kind of living, but not flowering or regrowing. Um, but after 2 years, I would think that they probably aren't coming back. And it could, yeah, I'm not exactly sure what would be going on there. It just kind of depends without knowing, what they look like before being pruned and all that kind of stuff. But I would just try one more time and see if that helps. And if not, then it might be time to move on. The other thing too, it's a little bit hard for me to do plant specific recommendations without seeing it. But you can always check in with the master gardeners. They do like Ask a Master Gardener events. And so if you take pictures, sometimes they can give you, really good advice because they can actually see what's going on. So just keep that in mind as an option.
Good point. Okay. Um, I think we're good to go ahead and start with the next section if you're
Cool.
ready.
All right, sounds good. Okay, so what I'm going to talk to you guys about next here is what we all learned as kids, the five Sonoran Desert seasons. No, actually, so we may be more aware of the kind of typical four seasons. But people who biologists and scientists who work in the Sonoran Desert kind of have these colloquially have designated five seasons within the desert, Sonoran Desert, and I'll give you one guess as to which season we have two of. Um, but we'll get into it. So in our winter season, so December through February, we tend to have cold, wet weather. So in the Sonoran Desert, we have um, two rainy seasons throughout the year. So we have a rainy season in the winter and we have a rainy season in the summer. In the winter, those rains tend to be milder, they tend to be slower, they tend to be less explosive and intense. And so these are more the storms you'll see where it kind of drizzles maybe for, the whole day or something like that. Um, so that tends to happen in the winter, and those winter rains are really important because when water flows like that, when it rains like that, the water is more able to soak in these really fast, excuse me, storm events like we've had this, especially this last one. Um, when water comes down with such high intensity, it creates a lot of runoff. And so we don't necessarily get to collect all that water. It kind of runs off and runs away. So the winter rains are really important for us. The other thing to note about our winters is that we can get freezing temperatures. It is not in the last couple of years been super common, but it is possible. And so that's just something to know. There are some deserts where that's not even, a possibility. And so it's good to know in terms of planning and design that that's something that could happen. Okay, and then we start to move into spring. Now, spring can kind of start a little bit early, at least like the activities of spring can kind of start early depending on the weather. So if it's really warm and we're not getting a breeze at that last tail end of February, some of this blooming, the wildflowers, that kind of stuff can start a little bit earlier. But typically, our spring's happening March through April. And this is when you'll see all the majority of blooming happens, especially non-native things, fruit trees, things like that. But lots of active growth and mild weather, not a lot of rain. And then we have our first summer. First summer's dry summer, and this usually happens during the months of May and June. It's very un it's not typical for us to get rain in May or June. This last year when we had rain in June, I think it was like the first time in 50 years or something. I can't remember what the date was. But anyway, it's very rare to have rain in this period of time. The weather's usually very consistently hot and dry with clear blue skies, and that's usually what it is. Uh, you will see some of the desert plants start to bloom during this period, so that this period of weather doesn't phase them. You'll start to see the um, kind of the tail end of the palo verdes. The mesquites will start blooming. The ironwoods will start blooming. The saguaros usually start blooming, and so that's kind of all happening during this first summer. And then we have, if we're lucky, monsoon summer. So this would be our second rainy season. It's generally July through mid-September. Um, there's some differences now in the way that they categorize this season, but the thing that can happen is we're still usually hot weather, right? But we can get rain. And these are the really intense rainstorms where there's a lot of water in a very short amount of time. And that can cause flooding and can cause damage. And the other thing is that, like I said, it can create more runoff. Um, so depends, this one always just depends. It depends on how much water we actually get. Some of the plants can kind of be reinvigorated by the water. Plants like ocotillos are really responsive to monsoon weather, so they can bloom again, during this time period. So it just kind of depends. It's a wait and see what happens kind of season. And then the fall, we have is again kind of a lull in rain. It's usually quite dry. Um, Can be warm, depends on the year, but can be a warm period of time. It's the best time of year to start planting. Especially if we have some warm weather, plants can kind of have like a second wind in the fall before it starts to get too cold, and they go into dormancy. All right. So those are some of the things to be thinking about during those different seasons of the year, and what might be happening. The next thing we'll talk about, as you're starting to think about the actual like mechanics of maintaining your yard, are some tools. So some essential tools, shovels. So obviously really important. The spade shovel that has the pointed tip is the one people traditionally have. It's also really important to have a flat shovel, especially if you're going to have rainwater harvesting features in your yard. The flat shovel is really great for shaping basins. So if you need to do any maintenance on your basins, those are really great. And also good for kind of clearing up and scooping up sediment if your basin fills up with sediment. So um, I really like pointing that one out as a good addition. And then I find that most people usually have a leaf rake, but I would also recommend having a hard rake. Again, a hard rake is really great for raking and kind of be useful for those other tasks, but it's also really great for shaping basins and things like that. So if you're doing grading and maintaining rainwater harvesting basins, uh, hard hard rake is essential. Then, if you're going to take on some pruning tasks yourself, I always recommend having these three tools on hand. So you always want to have a pair of hand pruners. So that's this one here that you can, use with your hand. And that's great for small branches. So things, that are like the diameter of your finger. And then a pair of loppers, which would be, basically it looks like the hand pruners, but with really long arms. These are great for reaching higher up and for larger diameters. So I think up to like um, an inch or an inch and a half, something like that. And then this is one that not everybody has, is a handsaw. And it might look a little bit intimidating, but this is a really great tool, especially if you're going to do your own pruning. You can get a lot of larger diameter branches with this as long as you're willing to do the work. But the other thing is that I find you can make more precise cuts with the handsaw because it just gets into little nooks and crannies a little bit better. And so that's one of the reasons to have one. Some other things you might want to use, the stirrup or hula hoe, which is this one on the left, is a good tool for weeding. It kind of still, like with a lot of weeding, it's easier to use when the soil is somewhat wet. And then you may want like a hand pick. So this is a pick, but it's, one that you can use with your hand. Also really good for weeding and for kind of a small work around landscape or water harvesting basins. Okay. So looking at those seasons again, what are some of the care items that we might want to do with each season? So the late winter, early spring is a busy time. This is when a lot of the work gets needs to get done because we're post winter, so we're kind of outside of that risk of there being any more freeze events, and kind of just before things really start getting off in the spring. And so that's why it's kind of this ideal spot. Uh, so one of the first things would be to prune back any winter dieback you might have had from the winter. Since we're not going to be at risk for any more freezing, this is a good time to do that. Many of our trees and shrubs will take an annual pruning at this time of year. And I say annual because most of our shrubs and trees really don't need to be pruned, at least from kind of a horticultural perspective, more than once a year. And so it's just a matter of finding the right time of the year and doing that pruning. Oh yes, okay. So I keep saying that last frost date. So typically our average last date of frost is around Valentine's Day. So if you can plan to do this pruning after Valentine's Day, there's a pretty good chance that you're not going to have another frost after you do it. And the reason for that is just that once you prune, those pruning points are kind of weak and susceptible to freezing, or if there's any new growth that happens, it would be really susceptible. So you just kind of want to wait as long as you possibly can. Okay, and then as we move into the late spring, summer, fall, there's a lot less to do, which is great because you probably don't want to be out there doing it anyway. Um, if you have annuals or wildflowers, you can do some deadheading if you want to kind of try to continue the flowering. Or you could do seed collection, and after those flowers go to seed, you could kind of collect those wildflowers, especially things like penstemon, which tend to die off in the summer. If you collect the seed, then you can have them come back the next year. Native grasses are another one of those spring trimming activities. So these bunch grasses or native grasses um, will take a pruning in the late winter, early spring. And so the best way to do that is, once a year during that time frame. And you actually just kind of bunch up the grass like a ponytail and trim the top. And you want to trim back until you're pruning about an inch of green growth off, because it's pruning that green growth that stimulates the grass to continue growing. So if you trim it, but you've only trimmed off kind of dead or dying parts, it may not come back as vibrantly. Okay, when you're doing your pruning, I encourage you to choose some more organic shapes than these. Um, so say no to hedging here. This kind of pruning where, shrubs, these flowering shrubs are pruned into shapes like this regularly, not only, well, I suppose that some people may prefer this look, but it's not what this plant looks like naturally. And some downsides to that mean that it will produce fewer flowers. Um, it will become more stressed over time because it is using uh, more water to regrow every time you prune it. And it can also you can kind of see how there's lots of growth on the outer side here, but interior into the plant, there's not a lot of leaf or growth happening in there. And that's because this interior of the plant is never getting exposed to sunlight. And so it just kind of creates a plant that's not very healthy and not very attractive. And so try to use, I'll show you some examples of more naturalistic pruning techniques. It will be less work for you, and better for your plants overall. Cacti generally very few maintenance requirements, and I really encourage making sure those cacti go in the right place so that they're not growing in places where they need to be continuously pruned, or because nobody wants to stick their hand in that prickly pear and be removing pads and pruning it. So make sure they have enough room to grow. But one thing to be aware of would be these cochineal infestations. So this little white fuzz that kind of looks like, cotton got stuck on this is actually a type of snail, and it can kind of take over. So one thing you can do is just to spray that off with a hose. You can even use a dish soap mixture that can kind of help dislodge uh, um, an infestation, or you can remove pads that are, if they're too far gone, it might just be easier to remove the pad altogether. Okay, so with trees and shrubs and cacti and everything, the first maintenance technique is right plant, right place. So the first thing you can do to take care of that plant is to make sure you put it in the right place. This is obviously the wrong place for this tree, and the wrong place for a plant or a tree means that you'll probably have to be doing more pruning and more maintenance to it than the plant actually needs. This is constantly having to get pruned on this side because it's constantly growing into the building and onto the roof. So if you put your plant in the right place where it can grow and reach its mature size, then you don't have to do as much pruning. So that's kind of step one. And then there's two techniques that I want to share with you guys that will be useful if you're doing some basic pruning, at home in your landscape. So one thing to be looking at is when you're making your cut is where you make that cut against the trunk of the tree. And when you're pruning, you always want to prune back to the next um, joint, right? So the next place that a branch connects to the trunk. Um, if you were to just cut this branch off here, that would be what we call a heading back cut, and it is not good for plant health. So you always want to cut back to a joint. And what you want to look for are two features. So there's the branch ridge, which is on top of the branch, and then the branch collar, which is at the bottom. The branch ridge is kind of this wrinkled area where the branch attaches to the trunk. And the collar is kind of like this protruded, kind of bumpy area that's underneath the branch. And what you want to do is make your cut just outside of those areas because those two areas are what the tree uses to close the wound. So that's where the tissue comes from to close that wound. So if you cut too far away from it, then the tissue can't grow over it. And if you cut through it, it impacts the ability of the tissue to grow over that. So you really just want to cut just outside of it. So you can see this C to D, that's a perfect location of cutting that. So a lot of times people will want to make, really flush cut, right? They want to make a cut here so that it's, as clean as possible. And that can be, that's not ideal because it doesn't allow that wound to heal. So we really want to kind of focus on that. And then the other thing to keep in mind when you're cutting is to use this 3-cut method. So especially if you have a branch that's very long, you want to make the first cut on the underside here and not all the way through. And what that does is it prevents the branch from falling down and stripping wood off of the bark. The next thing you do is make a cut here to take all the weight off. So that way, when you make your final cut, there's not a bunch of pressure from the end of the branch hanging there. And then your third cut is your final true, this is my actual pruning cut. And that way you can really focus on it, make sure you're getting it right, just right outside of the ridge and the collar. And so that has a nice chance of healing. These are, a couple of the really basic techniques that are very important. Again, the cooperative extension has a great guide available for pruning. And so I encourage you to visit their website and use some of their resources as well. Just going to try and kind of quickly go through here some, good and bad examples from trees. Some things you do want to be looking for, crown cleaning or crown thinning. We want to do this when we see damage like that occurring where branches are growing across each other. But it's not something that needs to be done every year or multiple times a year. Uh, so just keep that in mind. Again, I was talking about topping or heading back cuts. That's when you kind of make the cut mid-branch. Not good. Trees do not tend to recover from this structurally or kind of from a health perspective. It really introduces the risk of disease and bugs. So please, try to avoid that. And then the image up top here is an example of lion tailing, which I think is kind of a little bit self-explanatory. And this is really can be a problem for us here because this contributes to palo verdes and mesquites falling over because they capture so much weight in the edge of the canopy that it just takes the tree with it. Um, If we do have branches that break or somebody's made a poor cut in the past, that's a great thing to repair. And always pruning back to that next joint where that branch hits the tree trunk and making sure that that wound can heal. A hack job. So this is a great this is a great example of the wrong tool for the job. Somebody has used either a hedge trimmer or some kind of machine here to cut some very small branches, which could have much easily be easier done with a pair of loppers or, like I was saying, a handsaw. And the downside here is that all these wounds are things that tree has to recover from. It's all opportunities for disease to get in the tree, and so it's really not ideal. Um, just some more examples of that, like you can see again these heading back cuts that are happening mid-branch. Again, the tree's dying back there. It's not really able to recover that wound. Okay, so those were some examples of poor examples of pruning, and I'm just going to quickly kind of go through the weeds here. Um, Weeds, are one of those things that can actually be a little bit controversial. So, a weed kind of depends on, if you want that plant there or not. We're going to focus on plants that are non-native, but there can even be native plants that have a tendency to grow in an invasive way, even though they may not be a weed. So it all kind of depends on the eye of the beholder. We do have a state, official state noxious weed list that this is produced by the Arizona Department of Agriculture. As you can imagine, this focuses on plants that impact agricultural crops. So there's a little bit of a, not necessarily bias, but like that's the perspective that they take when they put this together. Some really common weeds that you'll see in the area, cheeseweed, this one that kind of has a heart-shaped, almost lily pad like leaf. You'll see that a lot. London rocket, another example. And a lot of times there will be a weed that is kind of the weed of the year, and you'll see it everywhere. Um, and then it changes each year. The one I really want to point out is the stink net. So that's the second one here. Even since I've been doing this presentation, it has become more and more of an issue. Stink net is an annual weed that pops up in the spring and has these tiny yellow globe-like flower heads. And this is one that you really, really want to pull before it sets seed. So if you see it in your yard or in your landscape and you can pull it, please do. It's a really problematic invasive species that's um, pushing out a lot of our native annual wildflowers and taking over a lot of our conservation areas. One thing to note too is that some people tend to have a dermatitis type allergic reaction to it. So if you've not worked with it before and you want to be pulling it, please make sure to wear gloves and just kind of protect yourself that way. The last thing I want to mention here in terms of weeds are some of these grasses, because there's a couple of grasses that are actually really problematic as well, including Bermuda grass, which is a grass you'll see everywhere. It's what we use for our lawns, but particularly buffalo grass and fountain grass. Um, Fountain grass in particular started as a horticulturally available plant. It's got these kind of cattail like flower heads on it, and it is highly invasive. And one of the reasons it's a problem is that it increases the temperatures of natural wildfires. So it's actually really detrimental to saguaros and things like that. And so hopefully you don't see it in the nurseries anymore, but you may see it pop up in your landscape and think that it's a great one to, oh, hey, kind of a free plant, let me keep it. And ideally, it would be great to have it removed and you can replace it with another variety of bunch grass. Um, this one on the left, the Muhlenbergia rigens, is a deer grass. There's a ton of varieties of grasses in that Muhlenbergia family. So you could pick, any one of those and it would be a great replacement instead of the fountain grass. Okay, so I'm just going to sum it up here. We're going to try and move from these clean, pristine, lifeless landscapes to landscapes that have life, to landscapes that improve over time, and to ones that we take a lot of joy in caring for. And I'll leave it right there and happy to answer any more questions that are either in the chat or that you guys have before you take off.
Awesome. We just got one. I have a Texas ebony tree. How do you keep sucker stems from coming back after trimming, both on the trunk and at the base of the trunk?
Yeah, that is a tough question. There are some trees that are just prone to suckers, and that's one of them. Olive trees are also like that. They're really prone to suckers. Um, One thing you can do is it can be kind of hard, but like really try to make sure you're making those, even when you're cutting those suckers off, to make those cuts, uh, where the bark ridge and the bark branch collar are, because that can help them grow and cover up that area as opposed to growing another shoot from that. Um, so that would be my first tip. It's just a really tricky, and then maybe to just try and get ahead of them before they turn into larger branches. But yeah, it's one of those things that kind of depends on the tree, and if it's the type of tree that is prone to it, it'll kind of always be prone to it.
All right. I don't see any questions right now, but feel free to put so many more questions in the chat if you have any. But thank you guys for sticking around so far. I hope you learned a thing or two. That was a really cool lesson. But I'm glad we talked about weeds a little bit. We recently just received over 2,000 native wildflower seed packets. So if you see the Phoenix Water Conservation Office, my team, at any local events, be sure to ask for those because we would love to sprinkle some more wildflowers around the city. But if you have any questions that you can think of later, feel free to email me. I'll send that in the chat right now. Next week we'll be hosting the fourth class in the Hydrate series. So this is going to be designing a water harvesting landscape, which Kaylee will also be teaching, and it pairs really well with this class. And obviously, Kaylee, you have an absolute wealth of knowledge for us, so thank you so much for sharing.
Yeah.
Be sure to register for that upcoming class the same way that you registered for this one. And we will also be posting the video, the recording to YouTube, so be sure to check out our website or the City of Phoenix YouTube channel to see that. I'll put my email and our website in the chat. Looks like we got a few messages. Let me look through. Yeah, rewatching will just be on the website. The recording will be on there. If you are trying to read the transcript, go ahead and send me an email. I can try to get that out to anyone who needs it. We got a question saying, what is the best resource for choosing the right plant and getting help with issues?
Hmm. So when I do plant research, one of the resources I really recommend is the AMWA website. So the Arizona Municipal Water User Association. Laura, I don't, you can probably maybe put the link in the chat, but
Yeah.
they have a really great, they have a hard copy handout that they make that I know most of the cities have to hand out, but they also have it on their website. And that's a really great resource for doing plant research. So if you're just kind of at that stage of trying to pick out what plants you'd like to use, most of those plants are available at nurseries, and then they're all low water use. So that's a really great resource. And then in terms of, if you have issues or questions, I always encourage you to visit your local nurseries. So, the local nurseries that are growing plants and selling plants that are native plants, you can always bring a picture or something to them, and they are really knowledgeable, so they can help you as well. And then, like I mentioned earlier, the master gardeners, they're a really good resource too, if you have questions on specific plants. So, or, even design decisions, part of that, their training as well. So, and feel free to reach out to me as well if you have any questions. I'm happy to help out.
Yeah, we also the master gardeners were mentioned too. They are a great resource. But I sent the AMWA link in the chat for the plant book. Um Someone said, how do you get wildflower seeds? So we'll be at a bunch of events around the city. So if you look at our Save Water website that I put in the chat, you can see our upcoming events. I think it needs to be updated. I'm the one that does that, so I will be updating it shortly. So you can come see us at events and we can give you some wildflower seeds. Someone also said, not sure if it's common knowledge, but Phoenix has a green organics bin, which is actually brown. If you request one, you can get a discount on your City of Phoenix bill for trash and water. I make sure our landscaper puts the trimmings in the bin. You put it out on the same day as your trash and recycling. Yes, thank you so much for mentioning that. That is a great point. Definitely check out the organics bin program. I will try to find that link as well. And yes, all Phoenix public libraries will have a seed collection, and they may have wildflower seeds, but they definitely do have a bunch of different type of edible um, plant seeds as well, if you want to check out local Phoenix libraries. Okay. Um, Yeah, but just be sure to give me an email if you have any additional questions. And yeah, we hope to see everyone next week. I'll stay on for a little bit to answer any questions, but I think 7:45 is when we end. So Kaylee, feel free to stick around or head out if you need to. But yeah, great session, everyone.
Cool. Thank you guys so much for coming, and I look forward to seeing you guys next week, and we'll talk about rainwater harvesting design. So if you've got a project that you've got in mind, it'll be a good one for you to come to next week. Cool. I'm gonna sign off here, Laura. Laura, if there's anything else, just let me know, and
Okay,
yeah, I'll see you guys next week.
sounds good. Yeah, I think we're done with questions anyways, so all good. All right, see everyone next week then.